We'll get ready for a whole new round of propaganda coming at the hands of Western countries against Syria. Has the rest of the world turned a blind eye to what's actually happening in Syria? We haven't. Vanessa Beeley, independent journalist and one of the great journalists of the world, has been following very closely what's happening and about to unfold in that country. The United States has a long history of teaming up with ISIS to destabilize Syria, carrying out terrorist attacks over the years in Syria, particularly northern Syria. But is something about to unfold in southern Syria that we need to be prepared for? Vanessa Beeley joins us now on the show to talk about Syria and go over what is actually happening there. Vanessa, welcome back to the show. Great to see you.
Oh, hi, Clayton. Thanks for having me on. It's a very dangerous time for Syria, so it's good to be able to talk about what's going on.
Yeah, the West is totally ignoring what's actually happening there right now, but some really big movements are happening. We want you to detail it for us. And I think one of the clearest indications that something is happening is you have 3 Republican members of U.S. Congress like suddenly showing up in Syria. Something's going on here. Can you lay the groundwork for what's happening here?
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned that, so I'll start off with that. So you had French Hill, Ben Klein, and Scott Fitzgerald, of course, not the author, the congressman, who entered Syria illegally through Turkish territory in the north at the crossing that is known as Bab al-Salame, which is under the control, actually, this is interesting, of 2 terrorist groups that have come under sanctions by the US very recently. So I wonder how that kind of plays out from a law perspective under the US Terrorist Act when they go back home. In the Northwest, of course, you still have effectively the domination by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or as it was previously, ISIS and then Al-Qaeda under the same leadership. Abu Muhammad Julani has been basically prepared for being presented as the opposition figure by the West, particularly by PBS, Martin Smith, and then more recently by France 24, who interviewed him in Idlib. Israel has bombed in the last 2 days Aleppo International Airport, which is really predominantly a civilian airport that had just welcomed West Asian businessmen to Aleppo for a manufacturing fair, a trade fair that was being held in Aleppo to show the kind of rejuvenation of the city after its occupation by Western-backed terrorist groups. In the northeast, the US has been basically ramping up its activity and its military footprint. We believe there's anything between 2,000 and 3,000 actual military personnel and contractors now on the ground inside northeast Syria. Of course, from there, what they've done is to trigger ISIS brigades. They've formed new military or militia brigades made up of former Free Syrian Army, which is effectively Muslim Brotherhood extremists, and ISIS. We know through the mountains of evidence that point to it that is another US proxy. ISIS, since the earthquakes in February, on February the 6th, have been carrying out concerted attacks against Syrian Arab Army positions, against oil convoys, against civilians, kidnapping civilians, as well as massacring them in central Syria, where the US has actually recently reestablished a former military base in central Syria, from which we presume it is controlling the ISIS operations against particularly Syrian military. There was a massacre of more than 25 Syrian Arab Army soldiers in the last 2 weeks, dozens of others injured when their bus was attacked by ISIS to the east of the Euphrates. What the US is trying to do is to close the last remaining land route from Iran through Iraq into Syria, that particularly during the earthquake provided essential humanitarian aid. And was regularly bombed and has been regularly bombed, particularly under the Biden administration. I think he bombed it within 24 hours or 24 days of inauguration, and by Israel. So the US wants to basically landlock Syria on the eastern flank and prevent the entry of any aid whatsoever. Of course, the US is occupying Syrian oil, stealing it on a regular basis, as are the Kurdish Contras that are the other US proxy occupying Syrian territory in the northeast. And in the last few days, actually, the US has bombed the last railway bridge in the northeast. And the Kurdish Contras have been basically uprooting the railway track and stealing it and trading it in Turkey. So essential infrastructure being completely destroyed, as of course it was in 2019, when the US finally admitted that it bombed women and children in Baghuz. And it, of course, destroyed the majority of the bridges over the Euphrates in previous years. So then coming down to the southeast, I'm going around Syria as a clock. Coming down to the southeast, you have the US illegal military base in Al Tanf, which is on the border with Jordan and Iraq. Now, in recent weeks, the US has brought 7,500 militants from the north, from the Turkish-occupied territories, to Al Tanf to train them with the intention to deploy them to the Syrian-Jordanian border to take control of the border. So again, to close off another land entry or border for Syria and Syrians. They've also been training 16,000 Druze militia. Now, Druze are an Abrahamic monotheistic sect that live in southern Syria in the area called Sweda. They also live in Lebanon and in Israel. There is a very small minority that is with the backing of Israel and, of course, the US, looking for autonomy, very similar to the Kurdish project in the northeast, and a federalist project to separate them from the Syrian state and to create an independent statelet. Of course, this is part of the US-Israeli cartel plan, which is to balkanize Syria and divide it into warring statelets. And this movement is, just quickly, this movement is basically now, of course, being power multiplied by the US at Al Tanf. And at Tanf, of course, they have this 55-kilometer exclusion zone in which the US has established both training ground for various extremist groups, including ISIS, and a base for weapons. Even Israel has launched attacks from Al Tanf because there it's protected by the US. Russia recently has been carrying out raids on the terrorist positions in and around Al Tanf. But what we're basically seeing, just to summarize, is a resurgence of the kind of 2011 narrative of peaceful protests in the south, the desire to overthrow President Assad. UN officials are calling for Resolution 2254, which is effectively regime change and political or interference in the political process in Syria.
And now you're starting to already see the propaganda pieces popping up. And this story is incredibly important. And for our audience that is not familiar with Syria, doesn't understand how it's being used as a proxy and what the United States has been doing in Syria, destroying this country. Beautiful country, one of the safest countries in the world up until 2011, and totally destabilizing this country, putting American troops and forces in there. And I think for most Americans, they can't even wrap their head around the idea that, wait a second, the United States is teamed up with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We've covered this on the show for years. But yes, that's exactly what's happening. They're teamed up with ISIS terrorist groups to carry out terrorist attacks inside of Syria against civilian populations, terrorizing the people of Syria. And now you have Russia hitting these positions, hitting these actual terrorists that the United States is teamed up with. And you're seeing these pieces of propaganda that have popped up. Today, you sent me a message today. I love this one, where they're literally putting out propaganda pieces written in English. It's clear that these are coming from Western influences. This is not something that Syrian people would do, right? What do these posters? What do these posters say? These are clear pieces of propaganda from the West.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite incredible. I was scrolling through the Sweda 24, which is the kind of US-Israel aligned media outlet in the region, in that southern region that we're talking about. And I saw these two images, and of course they have the Otpor fist, raised fist, with the English language slogan next to it. Well, I mean, Otpor, of course, was a George Soros CIA incubated movement to destabilize Serbia back in the late 90s. So, I mean, as a few of my friends said, well, my goodness, couldn't they find something original? I mean, it's crazy. And I mean, these people coming out on the street, they're relatively simple people. They're not going to know what uproar is. They're not going to know what this kind of signaling means. And the other poster was talking about UN Resolution 2254. Well, I can guarantee that the average man in the street in Sweden is not going to really think about writing in English about UN Resolution 2254, which of course is
Regime change.
when you strip away the UN language, it basically means regime change,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah, like protesters are going out into the street and they're somehow in favor of the United States teaming up with ISIS to terrorize their neighborhoods, and they're going to get poster board. And I joked with you offline that this sounds like something that Victoria Nuland drew up in her garage with Sharpies. This is the kind of stuff that we see.
yeah.
It's incredibly infuriating. The Russian response to this has been, of course, attacking some of these ISIS positions, hitting some of these terrorist positions. What do you think the broader Russian part of this story will be in the coming weeks?
Well, it's interesting because Russia has been showing a considerable display of force. And of course, Russia has been under provocation from the US also. The US has been deliberately violating kind of Syrian Russian controlled airspace and coming very close to Russian jets with their drones and with their own aircraft. I think more than 340 infractions into the kind of safety measures that are put in place between the two countries inside Syria in 1 month. So they're clearly also trying to provoke Russia to react. Now, what Russia has been doing, of course, it's been with the Syrian Arab Army leading a campaign of bombing and artillery targeting of Al Qaeda sites in the northwest. It also fired cruise missiles from its navy off the Tartus coast at ISIS positions in the Syrian desert, which that went on for a few days. And I think that was a very clear signal of force to the US to kind of try and dampen down the US enthusiasm to escalate militarily. And as I said, Russia has been bombing the terrorist positions in the area around Al Tanf to try and reduce their effectiveness. But at the moment, of course, the Syrian government is wanting to try and negotiate, because what people also need to understand, this isn't a kind of a blanket movement. This is a very small minority of the population of this region in Syria that are being backed by pro-Zionist factions in Lebanon and, of course, in Israel, and by the US, and by French and UK intelligence agencies that have been working on this project for a number of months and funded by Qatar to basically reignite what they hope is this call for regime change at a time that US sanctions have effectively pushed Syria into an economic free fall and depression, where civilians are living without electricity, without water, without food. Food prices are just skyrocketing, inflation, and so on. So in a way, they're taking the opportunity to ignite this now because they perceive that the government is weak. They perceive that the civilians are ready to take to the streets again, and they're wrong. Because actually the majority, and even the majority inside Sweden, are pushing back against the movement and saying, no, we want territorial integrity. We are part of the Syrian state. Yes, of course, everybody wants more electricity, more water, more essential infrastructure, but they're not prepared to go back onto the streets and to set the whole 2011, bloodshed rolling again. But the danger is the number of militants that the US now has in position in Al Tanf and in this area. And that includes ISIS, of course, that never really left the area.
Tens of
If
thousands.
they start to, if they start to carry out, for example, targeting of civilians, as the US regularly does, as they did in Maidan, as they did in Egypt, picking off civilians and then blaming it on the Syrian security service, that, there may be all manner of black ops that might get played out in the next few weeks to try and really push this forward.
Well, that's why we're doing this segment right now. It's just to bring
Yeah.
awareness about this, right? This is the game. This is what they do, target civilians and then try to blame it on the government and force a regime change. I mean, they're actively trying to do this now in Haiti, and they're doing this in Syria. So we're keeping a very, very close eye on it and making sure that we get this message out there. Don't fall for the propaganda. It's about to happen. So someone who's been doing an amazing job covering this is Vanessa Beeley. We'll have your Substack and your information linked up in the show description below. People, please subscribe to Vanessa's great work. Follow what she's doing there in Syria, and any developments that you think need a voice, please bring them to us, and we will make sure that we cover it here on Redacted.
Thank you so much, Clayton. I really do appreciate it. And yes, people should be aware that the propaganda is incoming, and to understand that it's a very small minority that the US is trying to turn against the Syrian state and the Syrian people again,
I mean, if you could have told like the families of the victims of 9/11 that the United States is actively working hand in hand with Al Qaeda and ISIS, and hey, they're brothers in arms. I mean, you would literally it would sound like you were making this up. It was fabrication, but it's actually the case. Vanessa, great to see you. Thank you so much for the great work, and we'll let you get back to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.